The moment my father stood up at my wedding reception and called me the family disgrace in front of 150 guests, I thought my life was ruined. But when the man in the back corner stood up, adjusted his jacket, and said, "Your Honor, I think this is the perfect time to serve you with a federal warrant for embezzlement and tax fraud," my father's world collapsed in the most spectacular way possible. Sometimes karma doesn't just knock on your door, it crashes your wedding with handcuffs. My name is Brenda Ramos, and I'm 28 years old. I own a small but successful restaurant called Sage and Thyme in Austin, Texas, where I work as the head chef and live what I thought was a pretty good life. I graduated from culinary school, built my business from nothing, and found love with an amazing man named Alex Dennis, who's a graphic designer and the most supportive person I've ever met. By any reasonable measure, I should have been proud of what I'd accomplished by my late 20s. But according to my father, James Ramos, I was a complete disappointment who had wasted every opportunity he'd ever given me. James is 56 years old, works as a senior executive at a major bank in Houston, and has spent my entire life making it clear that nothing I did would ever be good enough for the Ramos family standards. He wanted me to be a lawyer, a doctor, or at minimum marry someone wealthy and socially prominent. Instead, I chose to follow my passion for cooking, which he saw as beneath our family's status. James comes from old Texas money. His family has been in banking and real estate for 3 generations, and he's never let anyone forget it. He lives in a mansion in River Oaks, drives luxury cars, and belongs to the most exclusive country clubs in Houston. He's also one of the most controlling, judgmental people I've ever known, someone who measures success only in terms of money, social status, and what other people think of your choices. My mother, Francine Ramos, is 54 and has spent their entire 30-year marriage enabling my father's behavior and making excuses for his treatment of our family. She's a housewife who never had a career of her own, and she's completely dependent on James financially and emotionally. Whenever James would criticize me or my life choices, Francine would stay silent or even agree with him to avoid conflict in their marriage. I also have a younger brother, Logan, who's 25 and still in college studying business, following exactly the path that James always wanted me to take. Logan and I have a complicated relationship because he's seen how our father treats me, but he's also afraid of becoming the target of that same criticism if he stands up for me. He's caught between wanting to support his sister and not wanting to rock the boat with our parents. The tension in our family reached its breaking point when I got engaged to Alex. Alex is 30 years old, comes from a middle-class family in Austin, and makes a decent living as a freelance graphic designer, but he's not the wealthy, prestigious husband my father had envisioned for me. When I announced our engagement, James made his disapproval crystal clear. "You're throwing away every advantage you've been given," he told me during a family dinner that turned into a screaming match. "You could have married a lawyer, a doctor, someone who could elevate the family name. Instead, you're settling for some artist who works from home and choosing a career that any high school dropout could do." That conversation was the last time I spoke to my father for 6 months. I continued planning my wedding, hoping that maybe the reality of the situation would soften his heart and that he would choose to be supportive of my happiness rather than disappointed in my choices. My best friend and business partner, Fred Thompson, who's a pastry chef and has known me since culinary school, kept encouraging me to invite my parents to the Thompson wedding despite everything. "Family is family," he would say. "Maybe seeing how happy you are will change his perspective." Against my better judgment, I sent my parents a wedding invitation, hoping that love would win over pride, and that James would choose to celebrate his daughter's happiness instead of mourning what he saw as her failures. I had no idea that my wedding day would become the stage for the most dramatic reversal of fortune my family had ever experienced. Planning my wedding while navigating the complicated dynamics with my family was one of the most stressful experiences of my life. Alex and I had decided to keep the celebration relatively small and intimate, with about 150 guests, at a beautiful venue outside Austin that specialized in farm-to-table events. As a chef, I was personally involved in planning every detail of the menu, and I wanted the day to reflect both my professional skills and my personal values. The guest list became a source of constant anxiety because I wasn't sure until the last minute whether my parents would actually attend. After I sent the invitation, there was radio silence from Houston for 3 weeks. Finally, my mother called to say that she and James would be coming, but she warned me that my father was still very disappointed in my choices and might not be in the most celebratory mood. "Brenda, you know how your father is," Francine said during that phone call. "He loves you, but he's having a hard time understanding why you insist on making things so difficult. Maybe if you and Alex would consider moving to Houston, and if you could find a more traditional career path, things could be different." Even on my wedding day, my mother was suggesting that I should change my entire life to make my father happy. It was a pattern that had defined our family for as long as I could remember. Whenever James was unreasonable or cruel, the solution was always for everyone else to accommodate his expectations, rather than for him to adjust his attitude. The morning of the wedding, I was getting ready with my bridesmaids at the venue when my mother called to say that James was refusing to walk me down the aisle. "He says he can't participate in a ceremony that celebrates choices he doesn't support," she explained, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry, honey. I tried to talk to him, but you know how stubborn he can be." I was heartbroken but not entirely surprised. Alex immediately offered to have his father walk me down the aisle instead, and Fred stepped up to give a speech that James was supposed to deliver. My wedding party rallied around me, making sure that my father's absence didn't ruin what should have been the happiest day of my life. The ceremony itself was beautiful despite the family drama. Alex and I had written our own vows, and there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd when we promised to support each other's dreams and build a life based on love rather than external expectations. Looking out at our guests, I saw friends from culinary school, regular customers from my restaurant, Alex's family who had welcomed me with open arms, and a few relatives from my father's side who had made the trip despite the family tension. What I didn't realize at the time was that there was one guest in attendance who had a very specific professional interest in my father's presence at the wedding. A man I didn't recognize was sitting in the back corner, wearing a nice suit and taking notes during the ceremony. I assumed he was a +1 from someone else's invitation and thought nothing of his presence. The reception started well, with everyone enjoying the food I had personally designed and prepared. Alex and I had our first dance to a song that reminded us of our first date, and for a few hours, I was able to forget about the family drama and just enjoy celebrating with the people who truly cared about our happiness. But as the evening progressed and the champagne flowed, I noticed my father becoming increasingly vocal about his disapproval. He was making snide comments to anyone who would listen about my poor life choices and how I had wasted my education and potential. He complained about the venue being too rustic, the menu being too trendy, and Alex's family being not our kind of people. My mother kept trying to quiet him down, but James seemed determined to make sure everyone at the reception understood his position on his daughter's marriage. Several guests mentioned to me that they were uncomfortable with his behavior, and I could see Alex getting increasingly frustrated with his new father-in-law's attitude. The breaking point came during the toasts, when James apparently decided that he needed to address the crowd and set the record straight about what this wedding really represented in his opinion. What happened next would change our family forever. The disaster began when the DJ asked if anyone else wanted to make a toast to the bride and groom. I had specifically told my family that Fred would be handling the speeches since my father had declined to participate in the ceremony, but apparently James had changed his mind about staying silent. Without any warning, my father stood up from his table and walked to the front of the reception area. My heart sank as I watched him approach the microphone, because I could tell from his posture and expression that this wasn't going to be a loving father's blessing on his daughter's marriage. "I think it's time someone told the truth about this situation," James began, his voice carrying clearly across the reception venue. The room fell silent as 150 guests turned their attention to what they expected would be a father's heartfelt speech about his daughter's wedding day. What they got instead was the most humiliating public attack I've ever experienced. My daughter Brenda has always been determined to disappoint this family. James continued, his voice getting stronger and more confident as he warmed to his theme. Despite every advantage we've given her, every opportunity we've provided, she has consistently chosen the path that brings the least honor to the Ramos name. I felt like I was going to be sick. Alex reached over and took my hand, his face red with anger, but I was frozen in my chair, unable to move or speak as my father systematically destroyed me in front of everyone I cared about. We sent her to the best schools, gave her every educational opportunity, supported her through college, and this is how she repays us, James went on. She chooses to work in a kitchen like a common laborer instead of pursuing a respectable profession. She moves to Austin instead of staying close to family. And now she marries someone who can't even provide her with the lifestyle she was raised to expect. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. I could see my guests looking uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, and glancing at each other, uncertainly. Fred looked like he wanted to tackle my father, and Alex's parents seemed shocked that anyone would speak this way about their child at her own wedding. But James wasn't finished. He had apparently been building up to this moment for months, and he was going to say everything he had been holding back. Brenda has always been selfish and stubborn, he continued, gesturing toward our table. She refuses to listen to advice from people who know better. She makes impulsive decisions based on emotion instead of logic. And frankly, she has become an embarrassment to our family's reputation in the community. At this point, several of my friends were starting to stand up, clearly planning to intervene and stop this public attack. But James held up his hand and delivered what he clearly intended to be his finishing blow. Today, instead of celebrating, we're witnessing the culmination of years of poor judgment and wasted potential. Brenda, you have chosen to become the family disgrace, and this wedding is just the final confirmation that you will never be the daughter we raised you to be or the woman this family needs you to be. The word disgrace hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, I felt like every insecurity and self-doubt I had ever had about my relationship with my father was being confirmed in front of everyone who mattered to me. I started crying, not from sadness but from the sheer humiliation of being attacked so viciously by my own father on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Alex stood up abruptly, clearly intending to confront my father and defend me from this verbal assault. Fred was moving toward the front of the room, probably planning to physically remove James from the microphone. Several other guests were on their feet, looking outraged by what they had just witnessed. But before anyone could say or do anything in response to my father's cruel speech, something unexpected happened that changed the entire trajectory of the evening. The man in the back corner, the one I hadn't recognized, slowly stood up and began walking toward the front of the room. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what looked like an official document. "Excuse me," he said in a calm, authoritative voice that carried clearly across the silent reception hall. "I think this is the perfect time for me to introduce myself." The man who had been sitting quietly in the back corner all evening walked calmly to the front of the reception hall, and as he moved, I noticed that everyone in the room was watching him with growing curiosity. He was tall, probably in his early 60s, with gray hair and the kind of commanding presence that made people pay attention when he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the crowd in a clear, professional voice, "I apologize for interrupting this celebration, but I believe this is an appropriate time for me to properly introduce myself and explain why I'm here tonight." My father was still standing at the microphone, looking confused and annoyed by this interruption to his character assassination of his own daughter. "Excuse me, but who are you?" James demanded. "This is a private family event." The man smiled slightly and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a leather wallet that he opened to display an official badge. "I'm Judge William Harrison from the federal court system, Mr. Ramos. And actually, this is no longer just a private family event." The room erupted in confused murmurs as people tried to understand what was happening. A federal judge at my wedding? I looked at Alex, who was just as bewildered as I was, and then at Fred, who shrugged to indicate he had no idea who this man was or why he was here. Judge Harrison continued speaking, his voice cutting through the noise of confused conversations. Mr. Ramos, for the past 8 months, my office has been conducting an investigation into financial irregularities at Lone Star Community Bank, where you serve as Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending. My father's face went completely white. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice was shaking in a way I had never heard before. I'm talking about the systematic embezzlement of funds from commercial loan accounts, the falsification of loan documents, and the failure to report income to the Internal Revenue Service. Judge Harrison replied matter-of-factly. I'm talking about approximately $1.2 million that has been diverted from bank accounts into your personal investments over the past 3 years. The reception hall was now completely silent except for the sound of my father's labored breathing and my mother's sharp intake of breath from her table. Everyone was staring at this unfolding drama, trying to process what they were hearing. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, I'm here tonight because we've been monitoring your activities and communications, waiting for the right moment to serve you with the federal warrant that's been issued for your arrest. Your public speech here tonight, in which you attempted to lecture others about family honor and reputation, seemed like the perfect ironic timing. Judge Harrison reached into his other pocket and pulled out an official document. James Ramos, you are hereby served with a federal warrant charging you with embezzlement, wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right since everything you say from this point forward will be documented in the court record. My father looked like he was about to faint. He gripped the microphone stand for support and stared at the judge in shock. This is impossible, he whispered. There's been some mistake. Mr. Ramos, there's no mistake, Judge Harrison replied calmly. We have extensive documentation of your activities, including bank records, email communications, and a testimony from your colleagues who became concerned about irregularities in loan processing. We also have records of the luxury purchases you've made with embezzled funds, including the down payment on your recent vacation home in Colorado. The vacation home that my father had bragged about buying just 6 months earlier, the one he had described as a reward for his hard work and financial acumen, now it was being revealed as evidence of criminal activity. Judge Harrison turned to address the crowd. I apologize to the bride and groom for this disruption, but given Mr. Ramos's speech tonight about family honor and his daughter's alleged shortcomings, I felt it was important for everyone here to understand the full context of who has actually brought disgrace to this family. He looked back at my father, who was now visibly trembling. Mr. Ramos, federal agents are waiting outside to escort you for processing. You can come voluntarily, or we can make this more public than it already is. The man who had just called me the family disgrace was about to be arrested for federal crimes at my wedding reception. What happened next was the most surreal and satisfying moment of my entire life. Judge Harrison gestured toward the entrance of the reception hall, and 2 federal agents in dark suits walked in, approached my father, and stood on either side of him at the microphone where he had just finished destroying my reputation in front of 150 guests. James Ramos, one of the agents, said formally, "You're under arrest for federal crimes of embezzlement, wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Please place your hands behind your back." The room erupted in gasps and shocked conversations as my father was handcuffed at my wedding reception. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished with his revelations. Before Mr. Ramos is taken into custody, the judge announced to the crowd, "I think it's important for everyone here to understand the full scope of what we've discovered during our investigation, especially given the speech we just heard about family honor and disgrace." Judge Harrison opened a folder he had been carrying and began reading from official documents. Over the past 3 years, Mr. Ramos has systematically stolen funds from commercial loan accounts at his bank, falsified loan documents to cover his tracks, and used the embezzled money to fund an extravagant lifestyle that included luxury cars, expensive vacations, country club memberships, and real estate purchases. Every item he mentioned was something my father had bragged about to our family and friends. claiming they were rewards for his hard work and business success. Now we were learning that they were evidence of criminal activity. The total amount embezzled exceeds $1.2 million, Judge Harrison continued. Mr. Ramos also failed to report this income to the IRS, resulting in additional charges of tax evasion. When bank auditors began asking questions about irregularities in loan processing, Mr. Ramos attempted to manipulate records and blame discrepancies on junior employees. My mother was crying at her table, covering her face with her hands. Logan looked completely shocked, staring at our father as if he were seeing a stranger. The guests were silent, transfixed by this dramatic revelation. But Judge Harrison saved the most devastating information for last. During our investigation, he said, looking directly at me, we discovered that Mr. Ramos has been particularly concerned about maintaining his reputation in Houston's business and social community. In fact, he specifically told colleagues that he was worried about his family image being damaged by his daughter's choice to work in the restaurant industry rather than pursuing a more prestigious career. The irony was breathtaking. My father had been committing federal crimes while criticizing me for choosing an honest profession that I was passionate about. Mr. Ramos expressed concern to associates that his daughter's career choice reflected poorly on his family's status, Judge Harrison continued. He worried that people would think he hadn't raised his children properly or provided them with adequate opportunities. Meanwhile, he was systematically stealing from his employer and defrauding the federal government. Judge Harrison closed his folder and looked at my father, who was standing in handcuffs looking like his entire world had collapsed. Mr. Ramos, you spent this evening lecturing your daughter about bringing disgrace to your family name. The reality is that you have been the one engaging in criminal behavior that will destroy your family's reputation and potentially cost them everything. Then Judge Harrison did something that I will never forget as long as I live. He turned to me and spoke directly to me in front of all our guests. Miss Brenda, he said formally, I want you to know that during our investigation we looked into your business and your background as part of our due diligence. What we found was a young woman who has built a successful, legitimate business through hard work and talent. You have excellent credit, no criminal history, and a reputation for integrity in your industry. You are exactly the kind of person who brings honor to a family name. The federal agents began escorting my father toward the exit, but Judge Harrison had one final statement for the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize again for this disruption, but I felt it was important that you witness this arrest given the public nature of Mr. Ramos's accusations against his daughter tonight. The real family disgrace is not the young woman who chose to follow her passion and build an honest business. The real disgrace is the man being arrested for federal crimes who had the audacity to criticize anyone else's character or choices. As my father was led away in handcuffs, the reception hall was completely silent, except for my mother's quiet sobbing and the sound of the federal agent's footsteps on the wooden floor. The silence that followed my father's arrest lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 30 seconds. Then, slowly, the reception hall began to buzz with shocked conversations as our guests tried to process what they had just witnessed. My wedding had gone from a celebration to a public humiliation to a federal crime drama in the span of 20 minutes. Alex was the first person to speak to me directly after the agents left with my father. Brenda, are you okay? He asked, putting his arms around me as I stood there in complete shock. I know this is incredible, but are you actually okay? The truth was, I felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions that I couldn't sort through immediately. I was humiliated that my family drama had played out so publicly at my wedding, but I was also vindicated in a way I had never expected. For years, my father had made me feel like I was a disappointment, like my choices were wrong and my values were misguided. Now, in the most dramatic way possible, it had been revealed that he was the one with questionable values and poor judgment. Fred came over and hugged me tightly. Girl, I have never seen anything like that in my entire life, he said. Your father just got arrested at your wedding for embezzling over $1 million, right after he called you the family disgrace for being an honest business owner. This is like something out of a movie. Judge Harrison approached our table before leaving the venue. Miss Brenda, I want to apologize again for the timing of this arrest, he said. We had been planning to serve the warrant at Mr. Ramos's office tomorrow morning, but when we learned he would be here tonight, and especially after hearing his speech about family honor, it seemed appropriate to handle this matter immediately. Judge Harrison, I said, still trying to process everything, how did you even know about my wedding? How did you get an invitation? He smiled slightly. One of our investigators has been monitoring Mr. Ramos's activities for months, including his social media and public calendar. When he posted about attending his daughter's wedding, we saw an opportunity to serve the warrant in a setting where he couldn't deny his identity or attempt to evade arrest. I attended as an observer to ensure everything was handled properly. The judge handed me his business card. You should know that your father's assets will likely be frozen pending the outcome of his trial. This may affect your mother's financial situation significantly. If your family needs information about victim services or financial counseling, my office can provide resources. After Judge Harrison left, the reception continued in a very different mood than anyone had expected. Many guests came up to me throughout the evening to express their shock at what had happened and to tell me how sorry they were that my father had attacked me so publicly before his arrest. But the most meaningful conversations were with people who told me they had always admired my courage in pursuing my own path despite family pressure. Several guests mentioned that they had been impressed by my restaurant and my success as a business owner, and that my father's criticism of my choices had seemed particularly cruel given my obvious accomplishments. My mother left the reception immediately after the arrest, too embarrassed and upset to stay for the rest of the evening. Logan stayed and apologized to me repeatedly for our father's behavior, both the speech and the criminal activity that had led to his arrest. Brenda, I'm so sorry, he said. I knew Dad was hard on you, but I had no idea he was doing anything illegal. And the way he talked about you tonight was unforgivable, especially now that we know what kind of person he really is. The most important outcome of this entire experience was that it freed me from years of feeling like I needed my father's approval to validate my choices. His arrest and the revelation of his criminal behavior made it clear that his criticism of me had never been about my actual character or accomplishments. It had been about his own insecurity and his need to control others to feel superior. Alex and I ended up having a beautiful honeymoon despite the drama, and when we returned, we found that the story of our wedding had become something of a local legend. Several customers at my restaurant mentioned hearing about the federal judge who crashed a wedding to arrest the father of the bride, and many people expressed admiration for how I had handled such an unprecedented situation. 6 months later, my father was convicted on all charges and sentenced to federal prison. The family disgrace, it turned out, was never me.